The Emperor of China issued an order, not for war, not for law. The order was for his palace carpenters to build an exact copy of the Imperial bedroom and install it inside the private estate of a 22-year-old boy. That boy, within 1 year, would command the largest military on Earth. Generals with 40 years of battlefield experience would answer to him. Foreign envoys would bring tribute to his door. And then, on a single afternoon, after a single death, every record of him would be erased. His grave would be dug up, his family removed from the census. The historians who had documented his rise would quietly rewrite the entire story, not as the love affair that almost broke a dynasty, as a criminal conspiracy. His name was Dong Xian. He lived for 23 years inside a system that had no category for what he was. And that is exactly why it could dispose of him so cleanly when the time came. This is the story the Han Dynasty's official records tried to bury, and the parts they almost managed to erase are the most important parts of all. Before we go further, if you find yourself drawn to the history that official records tried to suppress, Crimson Historians is the channel built exactly for that. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, back to the palace. To understand what happened to Dong Xian, you have to understand the machine he walked into, because the Han Dynasty court was not simply a government. It was an ecosystem, layered, predatory, and governed by rules that appeared in no official document. Within that ecosystem existed a category that almost no Western history text bothers to name. They were called Nanse, the male favored, not eunuchs, not officials, not soldiers. Young men chosen for one thing. An emperor looked at them and wanted them nearby. For nearly 200 years, spanning the entire Western Han Dynasty, almost every emperor maintained at least one. The records name them, document the gifts, note the promotions. It was not hidden. It was simply never discussed in the scholarly tradition that shaped how history got preserved. And so it was quietly, methodically, forgotten. What that life actually looked like in practice was a daily performance of perfect availability. And Nancy had no schedule of his own, no private business, no space that was not potentially the emperor's space. He existed in a state of permanent readiness, present at meals, present in the evenings, present at whatever hour the emperor's mood required company. The gilded quarters and the priceless gifts were real. So was the cage they came in. The path into that cage was rarely a formal one. Unlike the female imperial selection ceremonies, where girls were examined, ranked, and assigned, the Nanse entered through proximity and accident. A young man assigned to a minor post near the inner court, a face glimpsed at a ceremonial function, a chance encounter during a tour of the outer chambers. There was no application, no training, no preparation. One day, a young man was a low-ranking functionary, running errands for senior officials. The next, he had been noticed, and once an emperor noticed someone, the machinery of the court moved to make that person available, immediately, completely, and without any mechanism by which the young man could reasonably refuse. The word consent does not appear in any of the Han records regarding these arrangements. The silence on that point is itself a kind of record. What the records also make clear is this: the nuns had no protection of any kind. Female imperial consorts had formal rank, codified titles, the possibility of producing an heir. Even after an emperor's interest faded, they retained their position in the machinery. The nuns had nothing that survived beyond the emperor's personal feeling. The moment the emperor died, they became a liability, a symbol of the previous reign's private excess, immediately useful to anyone who wanted to discredit it. That is the trap Dong Xian was born into, not through any choice of his own. He was a young man from a minor family who caught the wrong pair of eyes at exactly the wrong moment in history. Around 5 BC, a 20-year-old emperor named Liu Xin, known to history as Emperor Ai, took the Han throne. He had grown up watching his own authority be quietly managed by his grandmother's clan, the Wang family, and their powerful patriarch, Wang Mang. He was sharp and frustrated, and looking for something that was entirely, uncomplicatedly his own. Dong Xian was 17. His father held a minor secretarial post, low enough rank that the family had no influence, just high enough to place the son inside the palace complex. He was, by every surviving account, exceptionally striking, graceful, composed, the kind of presence that a room notices without being able to explain why. Emperor Ai saw him. Within days, Dong Xian had been reassigned as the emperor's personal attendant. Within weeks, he was sleeping in the imperial quarters. Then the gifts began, and they did not stop. Dong Xian's wife was granted the unheard-of privilege of entering and leaving the imperial palace at will. His sister received a high-ranking position in the imperial household. His father was made a marquis. 3 generations of a nobody family were lifted to the top tier of Han society in a matter of months. Then Emperor Ai ordered a private residence built for Dong Xian outside the palace walls. Not an estate, a compound, as large and as lavishly appointed as the palace itself, with a private walkway connecting the two. The imperial treasury was opened, precious stones, rare silks, ceremonial weapons from the armory. The spending was staggering by any measure. At the height of it, thousands of labourers were reportedly assigned to Dong Xian's various construction projects simultaneously. The private compound, the gardens, the ceremonial halls. The scale was not accidental. Emperor Ai was making a public statement with every beam and stone, visible to anyone who passed outside the palace walls. He wanted the city to see it. What the court did with this, publicly, was nothing. And that nothing was itself significant. Senior ministers who had spent careers navigating the fine line between honest counsel and imperial displeasure understood exactly what the scale of the favoritism meant. That Emperor Ai was not simply indulging a personal attachment, he was daring them to object. Several tried quietly, through the proper channels, private memoranda, carefully worded requests for an audience, oblique references in policy documents to the strain the construction projects were placing on provincial labour quotas. Every one of those approaches was ignored or punished. One minister who raised the matter too directly found himself transferred to an administrative post in a border province so remote that the appointment was understood by everyone in the capital as a form of exile. The lesson was absorbed quickly. You could disagree with Emperor Ai in private once. You would not make the same mistake twice. And then, in 2 BC, Emperor Ai did something the court had no framework to process. He appointed Dong Xian, 22 years old, no military training, no battlefield experience, no strategic record of any kind, as Minister of War, commander of all Han armed forces. The generals said nothing. The ministers said nothing. The court simply went quiet. It was during these years that the act occurred which would give this entire chapter of Chinese history its name. One afternoon, the emperor and Dong Xian were resting together. Dong Xian had fallen asleep with his head on the long trailing sleeve of the emperor's silk robe. When a matter of state required Emperor Ai to rise, he found he couldn't move without disturbing the sleeping man. So he took a small knife and cut his own sleeve off at the shoulder. He left Dong Xian sleeping. He stood, one sleeve and one bare arm, and walked out to attend to his duties. The historian Bangu recorded this in the Book of Han. It passed into Chinese literary tradition as Duang Xiu, the passion of the cut sleeve, and became the classical euphemism for male same-sex love that persisted for 2,000 years. But the gesture meant something specific in its actual political context. Imperial robes were not simply clothing. They were ceremonial objects carrying state significance. To cut one was a minor act of sacrilege against the protocols that defined imperial authority. Emperor Ai did it anyway, in front of witnesses, without hesitation. The message to the court was unmistakable. Dong Xian existed in a category beyond protocol. The emperor's will in this matter outranked every convention. the empire rested on, and anyone who wanted to test that conclusion was welcome to try. One minister did. He submitted a formal memorial questioning the favoritism. He was removed from his position. A court historian who noted the treasury expenditures were becoming destabilizing was silenced. The message stayed consistent. This was not a matter open for debate. What is easy to miss reading this 2,000 years later is how the Wang clan specifically interpreted that gesture. To them, the cut sleeve was not a romantic curiosity. It was a declaration of intent. An emperor who would damage a sacred ceremonial object for personal comfort was an emperor who had decided that his private will mattered more than the state's conventions. And an emperor like that was capable of anything, including dismantling the power structures they had spent decades building. What the official histories handle awkwardly is the fact that the court was not simply shocked by the relationship. It was alarmed by something more specific. Dong Xian's family had begun behaving like a ruling clan, using his proximity to the emperor to extract favors, override judicial decisions, settle private scores. The mechanism of imperial favoritism was being operated not just by the emperor, but by everyone connected to the favorite. And that connection now reached all the way to the military. The Wang clan watched this and understood exactly what it was. Not love, or not love alone. A transfer of factional power. Every gift given to Dong Xian was a resource taken from the existing structure. Every promotion was an insult to someone who had spent decades earning it. Wang Mang noticed these things and did not forget them. By 1 BC, the relationship had moved into territory that had no historical precedent. Emperor Ai ordered a tomb built for Dong Xian, a full imperial-scale mausoleum, placed directly adjacent to his own burial site. In Han cosmology, tomb proximity was not a logistical detail. It was a theological statement about which relationships persisted beyond death. The only figures who shared proximity with an emperor's tomb were his empresses and official consorts. Dong Xian held no title. He was not an empress. He was not a formal consort. And yet there was his mausoleum, rising from the earth beside the Son of Heaven's own. The court absorbed this in silence. And then, at a banquet, in front of ministers, generals, consorts, and foreign guests, Emperor Ai turned to look at Dong Xian and spoke openly about abdicating the throne for him. The room went completely still. The idea of an emperor handing the Han throne to a male favorite with no royal blood and no claim of any legitimate kind was so far outside the operating logic of Han political thought that no one had a prepared response. They sat in silence until an elderly minister rose and delivered a careful speech about the throne being a trust from heaven, not a personal gift to be assigned. What happened in the corridors outside that banquet hall is not recorded in any official document, but the pattern of what followed tells its own story. In the weeks after the banquet, Wang Mang began consolidating. Quietly, methodically, the way a man does when he has finally received the confirmation he had been waiting for. He called in obligations from military families he had cultivated for years. He strengthened his relationship with the Grand Empress Dowager Wang, his aunt, whose formal authority as Empress Dowager gave her the right to act on behalf of the throne in a succession crisis. He did not move against Dong Xian directly. That would have been both dangerous and premature. Instead, he simply made sure that when the moment came, everything necessary would already be in place. The emperor had given Wang Mang the most valuable thing an enemy can give you, a clear signal, delivered publicly, of exactly how far he was willing to go. Wang Mang filed it away and waited. Emperor Ai dropped the subject. Whether he was serious, testing the court's reaction, or simply unguarded in that moment, no one could determine. But the words had been spoken in front of witnesses, and in a court where information was currency, those words moved immediately to the people who most needed to hear them. Wang Mang heard, the generals heard, every senior official heard, and every one of them began quietly to plan for the moment the emperor died. He had been visibly deteriorating for months. The question was never if, it was when. Before we get to what happened the day Emperor Ai died, and what happened in the hours and days after, there is something essential to understand about the sources we are working with. The primary account of Dong Xian's life comes from the Book of Han, compiled by the historian Ban Gu in the 1st century AD. Ban Gu was meticulous. He recorded the relationship, the gifts, the cut sleeve, the tomb. But he was writing under the Eastern Han Dynasty, the dynasty that replaced the Western Han after an interruption caused by Wang Mang himself. Wang Mang, to justify his seizure of power, needed Dong Xian to be a villain. He needed the last years of Emperor Ai's reign to read as a story of corruption. A good emperor manipulated by a scheming favourite, not a love affair that nearly broke the dynasty's succession logic. So, the official court records Ban Gu was working from had already been filtered, already shaped. Anything that made Dong Xian sympathetic had been softened. Anything that made him look like an active schemer had been kept and amplified. What survived is the winning faction's version, and the winning faction had everything to gain by making Dong Xian monstrous. Reading it 2,000 years later, the actual human story lives in the gap between what the text says and what it has every reason not to say. And that story is stranger than the official version, because it has no clear villain. It has two young men, one with an empire and one with nothing, and an old machine that was always going to consume them both. On August 15th, 1 BC, Emperor Ai died. He was 26 years old. In his final weeks, he had tried to transfer authority to Dong Xian, giving him the imperial seals, the instruments a regent would use to govern in the name of an underage successor. Dong Xian was 23 years old. He held the seals, he commanded the army, he had technically everything he needed. He did nothing. The accounts describe him as paralyzed by grief, functionally collapsed, unable to issue orders, unable to call the generals, unable to activate the network of people whose positions depended on his continued power. He sat in the palace while the machinery convulsed around him. The historical record gives us a few specific details about those hours, and they are worth sitting with. Dong Xian reportedly remained in the inner chambers adjacent to the emperor's body, attended by a small number of servants who were themselves uncertain what orders, if any, they were still following. Messengers arrived from senior officials requesting guidance on immediate state matters, the seal of succession, the formal declaration of a new emperor, the announcement of mourning rites that needed to begin within hours of a ruler's death. Dong Xian did not respond to them. He did not eat. Witnesses who passed the chambers described a young man sitting with the stillness of someone who had not yet processed that the world outside had already moved on without him. He had spent 5 years inside a system that functioned entirely because one man wanted him there. That man was gone, and Dong Xian, who had never existed inside the machinery on his own terms, had no idea how to operate it alone. He was 23 years old, sitting with the body of the only person who had made any of it real, while everything built on that reality collapsed around him. Wang Mang moved within hours. The Grand Empress Dowager Wang, 80 years old, politically experienced in ways Dong Xian could not begin to match, walked into the palace and took back the imperial seals. There is no confrontation described in the records. She simply walked in and took them. The guards who answered to Dong Xian did not stop her, because they already understood what was obvious. His power had been the emperor's, loaned to him by affection. The emperor was gone. Wang Mang was summoned, command of the imperial guard transferred to him before the emperor's body had been moved to the preparation chambers. Then came the decrees. The first accused Dong Xian of failing to attend properly to the emperor during his final illness, a charge designed to strip him of the one thing the court couldn't easily take, the moral legitimacy of having been the emperor's devoted companion. If he had been negligent, he was not a grieving lover. He was a careless opportunist who had taken everything and given nothing. The charge was almost certainly fabricated. It didn't need to be true. It needed to be official. Dong Xian was stripped of all titles. His family was barred from the palace. The compound Emperor Ai had built for him was seized by the state. That night, Dong Xian and his wife died by suicide. The records note this without elaboration. No circumstances, no final words, just, he died, at 23 years old. Death was not the end of what was done to Dong Xian. It was the beginning. First, the tomb. The imperial-scale mausoleum Emperor Ai had built beside his own burial site. The theological statement about the permanence of their bond was dismantled. Dong Xian's body was exhumed and reinterred inside a prison compound. He had been placed, in life and in burial, beside an emperor. Now he was placed behind prison walls. The statement the tomb had made was literally removed from the landscape. Second, the family. Every member elevated by imperial favour was stripped of their rank and property. His father, back to nothing. His sister, title revoked, removed from the palace. The entire extended family was then exiled to the most remote administrative territory in the empire. Not nearby, where someone might help them or remember them, as far from the centre of power as geography allowed. Third and most sophisticated, the record. The official account of Emperor Ai's reign was not deleted. That would have been too obvious, would have raised questions about what was being hidden. Instead, it was reframed. The narrative arc was reshaped from a love story into a cautionary tale. Dong Xian's promotions were presented as corruption, his family's enrichment as evidence of scheming. The cut-sleeve story survived. Bangu was too careful to discard it, but it was surrounded by enough negative context that any reader arriving fresh would be primed to see it as evidence of an emperor who had lost his judgment. Not a man in love, a ruler who had been manipulated. The specific technique is worth noting because it is still used today. Bangu placed Dong Xian's biography not among the records of honoured officials, but in a section reserved for the emperor's personal favourites, grouping him with figures associated with excess and poor governance. The biography itself begins by cataloguing everything Dong Xian received before it says a single word about who he was. That sequencing is a choice, and it is a choice that shapes every interpretation that follows from it. Dong Xian was not the only one erased that year. In the weeks following Wang Mang's consolidation, the records show a systematic purge of everyone connected to the emperor's personal court. The attendants, the servants, the minor officials, whose appointments had come through Dong Xian's influence, rather than through normal channels. Most were simply dismissed and returned to whatever obscurity they had come from. A smaller number faced formal accusations: corruption, dereliction, misuse of imperial resources, charges that mirrored the ones used against Dong Xian himself. The pattern was deliberate. By spreading the language of corruption across an entire network of people, Wang Mang ensured that any future attempt to rehabilitate Dong Xian's memory would require rehabilitating all of them simultaneously. It was an elegant piece of political architecture, not just erasing a person, but erasing the entire social ecosystem that had made that person possible, so thoroughly that even sympathy for him required a level of effort most historians would not bother to attempt. The erasure was designed to be self-reinforcing, and for most of 2,000 years, it was. The result? A version of history that acknowledged Dong Xian existed, too many witnesses for outright denial to work, while ensuring that no future reader would feel anything about him except contempt. For most of the 2,000 years that followed, it worked. Wang Mang ruled China for 15 years. His reforms, land redistribution, currency restructuring, bureaucratic reorganization, failed badly. His economic policies caused inflation. His wars were largely unsuccessful. The aristocratic families he needed turned against him. In 23 AD, during widespread famine and rebellion, a mob broke into the Huaiyang Palace. Wang Mang was found in the throne room. He was killed, dismembered, his head displayed publicly, and reportedly kept by successive dynasties as a trophy for approximately 200 years. The Eastern Han Dynasty that replaced him then wrote the history of his reign, finding, as Wang Mang himself had found, that a dead man's story is most usefully shaped by whoever holds the pen afterward. The pattern this reveals is not specific to China. It appears in every pre-modern court culture, with detailed records: Ottoman, Byzantine, Roman, Mughal, European. Someone with no structural power finds proximity to the person at the top. That proximity generates influence. The influence generates opposition. The opposition is suppressed while the patron is alive. When the patron dies, the opposition acts. The favourite falls, the record is rewritten, and the new power structure uses the rewritten record to justify everything it just did. What made the Dong Xian case extreme was the velocity. 5 years from minor secretary to military commander. One afternoon from most powerful man in China to political corpse. That velocity was itself a product of Emperor Ai's psychology, his impatience, his desire to use the relationship as a weapon against the Wang clan's stranglehold on his court. Dong Xian may have had no idea he was being deployed in a factional war. He was a teenager when it started, but Emperor Ai's escalating public favoritism was not politically innocent. It was a sustained provocation, a daily message to Wang Mang that a new order had begun. When Emperor Ai died, Dong Xian inherited every enemy that provocation had made, with none of the power that had kept them in check. Wang Mang dismantled the tomb, exiled the family, reshaped the record, but he could not reach the phrase. Dong Xian, the passion of the cut sleeve, entered Chinese literary language and persisted for 2,000 years. Poets used it, playwrights referenced it, novelists embedded it in fiction. Stories survive differently than official accounts because they don't require institutional maintenance. An account needs someone to keep printing it, teaching it, treating it as authoritative. A story that enters a culture's emotional vocabulary becomes self-sustaining. People pass it forward because it describes something true about human experience that the official record, oriented around protocol and succession and administrative function, has no interest in preserving. 2,000 years later, the image is still there. A knife, a silk robe, a man who chose not to wake someone he loved. That single gesture in a palace afternoon in 3 BC turned out to be more durable than the tomb, more durable than the titles, more durable than the dynasty itself. Because the machine could erase everything it could name and classify and file, it could not erase the thing that had no official category. Dong Xian had no official category. That is what made him erasable. And in the end, it is the same thing that made him impossible to completely erase. The stories that official records tried to bury are exactly the ones worth telling. If you want more of them, subscribe to Crimson Historians, and I will see you in the next one.